This is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza.
One thing about my education journey is that there are times where I have felt so alone. And alone in the sense that, I'm physically alone, but also mentally, emotionally. And as an indigenous student, I've oftentimes felt so alone that, it is kind of scary.
Stories about Native American students are rarely told in education, and when they are, coverage is often a one-off piece, usually around Thanksgiving. We're delighted to welcome Sasha Aslanian, correspondent and producer for APM Reports, to EWA Radio. Thank you for coming on to share your experiences about your audio documentary, Standing in Two Worlds, Native American College Diaries. Sasha, I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, so welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
We had also invited Ruben Quito Stately, one of the three students featured in the documentary. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here. So, Sasha, it's just you and me.
Yeah.
So, you gave three Native American students, Ruben, Neve, and Archie, audio recorders and weaved together their experiences in a documentary. It was just beautiful to listen to. And Sasha, I have to say, in a shameless plug for the Education Writers Association, I should say this project was supported by an EWA fellowship.
No, that's not a shameless plug. That was crucial.
You could have chosen any story. Why did you decide to focus on Native American students?
So I think what the reporting fellowship sort of opened up for me was a chance to think about what was a dream project that I had been wanting to do, that had been sort of on my, wish list, but that I just hadn't been able to get off the ground. And about a decade ago, I had done a youth media series, and I had worked with a wide range of high school and college age students to produce stories about their own lives and covering everything from being young, gay, and homeless to being an undocumented student. And I several times had tried to work with Native American students, and despite really careful handoffs from trusted teachers who had recommended these students and who had great stories, I was never able to get any of those students over the finish line. And so it stuck with me that I still really had wanted to partner with Native American students. And since I now cover higher education, this was perhaps an opportunity, and I really wanted to do a youth-produced project. And so I applied for the EWA reporting grant with the idea that I could have the reporting grant pay stipends to the students.
It's interesting that you aren't in the documentary at all, not even to introduce the students or to set up the piece.
No.
Why did you make that editorial decision?
Yeah, I really wanted the hour to feel like it came from these students, and I wanted to be in the background as much as possible. And one of the things that I did, because obviously we were working under the pandemic, and the students live in different parts of Minnesota, and we did have a fourth student who is in a bonus episode of the Educate podcast who goes to Stanford University and lives in Hawaii. And so we would periodically get together on these Zoom calls, and I just loved the interaction of the students. None of them had known each other ahead of time, and the way they would pick up on things in each other's stories. I still remember, the very first Zoom call, and Camille from Hawaii introduced herself, and Archie from the Fond du Lac Reservation way up in northern Minnesota was like, "Oh, that's so dope what you're doing with the language reclamation in Hawaii. We're trying to do the same thing." And so there was this sort of instant bond between them, and I just really wanted that energy in the hour, rather than having a public radio person like me sort of lead the audience through their stories.
Well, I wanted to introduce Ruben the way he was introduced to me in the documentary. So we're going to play a little clip.
Hamidakiapi, Ruben Amakiapi, Gamaza Didi Hemie, Manija ska washichiwi St. Paul, imacha kedo, ga wana shakpeo tuan wati, bresha ka aisanti himatahan, damakota. That's how you say hello in Dakota. Totally kidding. All right. But if I'm going to come speak to you all, I need to speak to you all in my mother tongue, the Dakota language, the original language of the land that we're standing on. Manishota Makoche, we called it, for many, many, many years, thousands of years before anyone else was here.
Sasha, I love the way that little piece of tape captured his personality. I mean, I felt all the students' personalities were so multidimensional. There's one student who's a super achiever who talks about in the Hopi culture, running as a healing force. She wants to be an orthopedic surgeon. One dropped out of college and talks about his involvement in gangs and now how he wants to be a teacher as a way to atone. He goes back to college close to his home, and another student has to leave his home to go away to college to be successful. So how did you approach the idea with them, Sasha? And were they hesitant?
One thing that was interesting is when I had done youth-produced radio in the past, often it was with students who aspired to be media makers. And in this case, none of the four of them want to be journalists, much to my regret. A couple of them want to be teachers. One wants to be a surgeon. One wants to be a volcano scientist. So they're in really different career tracks. But what they did recognize was that this would be an opportunity for them to tell their story and hopefully be heard by other young Native students. They were most interested in trying to inspire the kids who come after them and to say, there's nothing special about us and you can do it too.
How many hours of tape did you have in the end? And did you transcribe all of it?
Yes. So I would have the students upload audio to Dropbox, and I had, I would say I had a pretty big range of audio for each student. Some of them really got into audio diaries. And Archie, like at the end, I had to say, like, stop, like, we've got it, like, please, no more. So he was really on a roll with it. And for others, it was less comfortable. They might really like to interview other people, other classmates or people in their lives, and weren't so much into the audio diaries. But I would say that I probably had 5 to 10 hours for each student and then culled from there.
You know, talking about interviewing other people, one of the things I loved is that the experts are so woven into the story. You know, the college professor, a mother, a roommate. It wasn't like you stop the story and then it's like, and now let's hear from so-and-so expert. This sounded very organic. Did you all talk about setting up those meetings in advance?
Yeah. So as we brainstormed each student's story, one of the questions that I asked them was who had influenced them, who had influenced their decision to go to college in the first place, who had been a crucial person for them in their college experience. And so each student had a mentor, which I think is also, that is a real indicator. I think that's an important indicator of a student who's going to make it is, do you have an adult in your life who is your champion? And crucially, all of these students had that. And so they all were Native American professors, parents, scholars. And so they were somebody known to the student who also had a story of their own of how they had made it through college. And so we talked a little bit about what you might want to ask those in those sort of expert interviews, I guess, we would call them. And so we had like a kind of a sense of what we wanted out of those interviews going in, and then left them really as a Q&A in each of the stories so that you had the feeling of these students sitting down with this person. So it didn't feel like just a talking head kind of interview.
I'm Kavitha Cardoza, the host of EWA Radio, and my guest is audio extraordinaire Sasha Aslanian, supervising producer in the audio documentary Standing in Two Worlds, Native American College Diaries. So, we're familiar with educational outcomes of Native American students, and they're pretty bad on most measures. Sasha, how did you approach being true to the data, not sugarcoating it, while not stereotyping?
Kind of the elephant in the room, if you're talking about an education story about Native American students, is that it's going to be a litany of failure, that the story is going to focus on low high school graduation rates, low college enrollment, low college graduation, and the numbers are stark when you look at the breakdown of Native American students. And that was not the story that these students want to tell. And so we set out to tell a very different kind of story about students who are succeeding in college. And you can hear in their stories some of the barriers that they come up against. And they talk about these with their mentors of, higher rates of poverty. And what does that mean in terms of, trying to help students make it through medical school when they don't come from families with doctors in them? And so we wanted those things to become clear to the audience. But really, the stories that these students tell are uplifting, charming, inspiring, students who are achieving what they want to get out of their educations. And that ultimately was the point of the hour. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in my first meeting with the students, we talked about, what do we want this hour to be? And Ruben Keto Stately said, stop telling my people we're sick. And he said, instead of dwelling on the negative, it's so important for kids to hear success stories. The students want young Native people to hear their stories and to think, oh, I can do that too. And that was really what they wanted to get out of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was covering a Native American protest once in DC, and I was recording some of the music they were playing, and someone from a tribe approached me and said, you can't play that on the radio, that particular music. It was sacred. And I'm so glad he told me, because I would never have known. So for reporters who want to cover Native American stories, what are some of the ways you would suggest being sensitive, Sasha, like some things you've learned over this project that we can learn from?
Yeah, so one of the things that you learn is that it is important to have permission to be in a space and to be recording, and generally that permission is coming from an elder. Ruben is a musician, and so I said, well, we should have some of your music in the piece. When are you performing next? And he said, oh, actually tonight over at the American Indian Center in Minneapolis. And I said, oh, great. Can I come? And he said, oh, sure, yeah, it's open to everybody. And I said, can I record it? And is there somebody I need to ask? And he said, no. He said, this isn't ceremonial, and this is just a celebratory powwow, so it's fine for you to be there, but I'm glad you asked. And so I think when in doubt, always figure out if you need to get somebody's permission, and to make sure to ask, if you don't know, ask somebody who you should be asking permission of and how that request should be made. Another tip that I got from Charlotte West, who's another EWA member and had done a reporting fellowship in a previous year, she recommended hiring a sensitivity reader. And we had actually tried to find a Native American editor for the project and weren't successful in doing that. But we did hire a sensitivity reader who listened to the rough mix of the story, gave a reaction. And we wanted to just make sure that, even though these were Native American students who were telling their stories, we just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that slipped past or any kind of problematic framing that maybe my editor and I hadn't caught. And so that was just a really reassuring step to the project that was a a small but very worthwhile investment of money. And I guess one other thing was just making sure that, in this case, because the students were telling their own stories, there was less of that power differential of I'm the reporter and I have all the power over how this story is going to be told and the tape and whatnot. But one of the lines that I had written originally for Neve was something to the effect of, when I got to college, I had to learn how to navigate two worlds. And she stopped me and she said, Sasha, I've had to navigate two worlds my whole life. It wasn't going to college that did that. And it was just one of those moments where I just was humbled thinking, yeah, I'm this far along in the project and I'm still not getting it. And so I was glad that she and I had the kind of relationship where she could point that out to me and we could make sure that the script was accurate and, was expressing what she really wanted to about that experience of going off to college.
I would just urge reporters to do more stories on Native American students. I mean, a few years ago, Sasha, there was this fantastic article that came out called Land Grab Universities about how so many educational institutions were built on Native land. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, I would have loved to cover Native American students, but they've never been anywhere I've lived. And that article had an interactive website, and you could see where populations were, tribes and reservations all over the country. And I was like so ashamed to see there was just so many near me. And then after your story came out, I did some more Googling and I was like, Native American students are all over.
Yeah, I loved that Land Grab University's piece that High Country News did. And it really drove home for me the idea that this is a local story wherever you are. There are Native American students going to the schools that you cover. And if there are few of them, that can be a story. If there are a lot of them, that can be a story. But just getting to know them and asking, who they are and what is there for them. Like Neve in our story tells the story about showing up at this university and learning that she was one of 3 Native students and that there were really no resources for them. And so part of her college experience was trying to create that support network around herself. She ended up volunteering with Native American parents in the Rochester School District just so that she could have that feeling of community because she was having a difficult time finding it at the university. So I would encourage reporters to look to see what is happening on their campuses and schools that they cover. If there are American Indian education programs in the schools, that's what we have in Minnesota. And finding out what the stories might be.
Sasha, let's listen to a little bit of her in the documentary, which is just so beautiful.
There was one moment where my chancellor came up to me and was like, we're going to miss you. Like, you have done so much for this university that, you're not going to go unremembered. Like, one thing she's asked me was if I was going to continue to be on the American Indian Advisory Board. She was like, because you jump-started this. That's a huge honor to know that I have that impact on people.
Yeah, the chancellor. Mm-hmm. She's really proud that she left that legacy. But back to this being a local story. So even if you think that there aren't Native communities, near you, any of these 574 federally recognized tribes, that there are still very likely Native students in the schools that you cover. This idea of land acknowledgements has gotten a lot of traction, and the Land Grab Universities piece that you mentioned, I think, has spurred some universities to look at, well, what are we doing with this funding that continues to be derived from these stolen lands? And so some universities are turning those into scholarships, and has been more of a movement along those lines. And so, that's something that's in play in communities across the country that merits coverage.
I wanted to ask you, what is your takeaway? With every in-depth project, I feel reporters carry one, well, maybe more than one, but at least one thing with them, that becomes part of who they are. And what would that be for you after this story?
I think for me, just the experience of getting to know these young people and getting to work with them to tell their stories has just been, it's a different kind of journalism, but ultimately just incredibly satisfying. And Archie texted me to say he couldn't believe how many people had heard the piece, and people from his past are hitting him up. And so it's just been an absolute delight to watch what the experience is like for them to have their stories go out in the world and to be so well received.
Well, I really hope after this episode airs, there'll be even more people, because I would urge everyone to listen to this documentary. It's great.
Thank you.
We're talking with Sasha Aslanian about her documentary Standing in Two Worlds, Native American College Diaries. Thank you so much, Sasha, for making the time to chat with me.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavita Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Sasha Aslanian about covering Native American populations, or finding experts, or any tips or stories you've done that you can share? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter @EdWriters. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening.